The Holy Gospel is found in St. Luke in the 24th chapter. Now, the disciples were talking about this, that is, Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Well, in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering. He said to them, "Have you anything to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are my witnesses of these things. And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." And then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they were continually in the temple, blessing God. The gospel of the Lord. Well, we are here embarking on the end of the month of June, beginning of July, and of course we have the big holiday in front of us this week on Thursday, I don't even know what day of the week it is, but the 4th of July. And we get to celebrate, it stands for many things, the 4th of July, but I thought one of the things that most comes to mind when I think of the 4th of July is freedom. Okay, freedom, that whatever the 4th of July is, at some level, it's about freedom. And when we think about freedom, whether we think about it for ourselves or for a nation or whatever it might be, there's always two ways to think about freedom. There's thinking about freedom from something, and there's thinking about freedom to something. And if you think back, if you look back at the verses that Charlie read for us from Galatians, Paul's talking about freedom, and he's talking about the freedom from all the negative things, dissension, slavery, lying, all that sort of thing. And he's talking about freedom for all the positive things like generosity, life, and hope, and peace. So freedom as a gift, then, carries with it both a freedom from things that are keeping us in bondage, as Luther would say, or keeping us trapped, but it also is a freedom, then, that once we are freed from those things that enslave us or bind us or whatever the case may be, that we are now freed to live the life that God has called us to live, or to live as the people God has made us to be. So there's a freedom from and a freedom to. And what happens with the gospel, and that story that I read here out of the end of the Gospel of Luke, is that the disciples see Jesus ascending into heaven. That's how the gospel ends. Jesus goes up into heaven, they're all standing there looking, and then they get so excited, they run right back to church and they start to tithe. It's an amazing story. That was a joke. I'm back. The jokes are going to be here. So they're in the temple praising God, and of course when they do that, they're thinking about all the stuff that Jesus had taught them. And these are people that knew Jesus face to face. These are people who experienced Jesus on a daily basis as a person like them. Although Son of God, he was around with them, and they were thinking of all the stories. It's not too unlike what happens if you've ever gone to a funeral, and afterwards you start to tell stories of the person who has recently passed away, and you have vivid memories of something they said or how they behaved or whatever crazy thing that strikes you in that conversation. And as you do that, of course, you begin to see that Jesus, when the disciples are there thinking about what Jesus has done, they realize that he's kind of set them free from a lot of things. A lot of things that they had kind of just gotten from the culture, kind of gotten growing up as kids in Judea or Jerusalem or Galilee or wherever they were from, even Samaria in some cases. And that in the process of getting all these things that have been there, Jesus had kind of come into their life, and he had freed them. It's like he opened their eyes to what was really going on. He took away all the things that were trapping them and leaving them sort of stifled or behind. That they got frustrated with. They didn't understand, how God could love somebody that, they always talked about God loving people who had blessings, who had money, and then people who didn't have it. They always wondered, well, how does God love somebody who doesn't have money? Or how does God love somebody who doesn't fit into society? Or how does God doesn't love somebody who isn't quite the norm, or whatever the case may be? And Jesus helped all these people to find ways that God could love them in spite of the fact that they hadn't attained what society said was the way to go. And so they'd been freed from all these misconceptions in their lives, all these things. For example, one of the great misconceptions that people have about my particular job is that pastors have to have short hair, especially if you're male. Where did this come from? Why? Jesus didn't. None of the disciples, as far as we know, did. Even Luther had the shaggy locks every now and then, especially in the winter. But somewhere along the line in our culture, whatever, pastors, kind of wore short hair, they either wore albs or suits or whatever, and that kind of became the defining characteristic. Someone like me comes along, and for 30 years, people are like, whoa, you don't even cut your hair. I got so tired of people asking me about whether I cut my hair, I stopped wearing socks. So then they could at least say, hair, whatever, you don't have socks. We get trapped by these kinds of misconceptions. So what happens then is that as we begin to think about all the stuff that these disciples, when they're thinking about Jesus, you got to remember for these folks, this is like days old for some of them. Some of these folks may have only been disciples of Jesus for a few weeks or months before he dies. And so for these people, they're like, I can't believe that I have this kind of ability, this freedom now. I'm not trapped by all these old things that seem to kind of get in my way of doing the stuff that I think God's calling me to do. And so when Jesus frees them from all that kind of stuff, the first thing they do is they go back in the temple. Now, I tell this story because, as many of you may have heard, the book of Acts is also written by the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And so when the book of Acts, which comes, that goes in the Bible, you have the Gospel of Luke, you got the Gospel of John, then you got the book of Acts. So you got these two stories, and Luke and Acts are together. But in the Bible, they're separated by the Gospel of John. So what happens, in the book of Acts then, the writer, just after he has finished writing the story about the disciples, they all go into the temple, and they're praising God, and they're giving thanks for all the stuff that they've been freed from, their own angers, their own frustrations, the expectations placed on them by themselves or their grandmother or society, whatever the case may be. So they're free from that. So the story then in the book of Acts is the exact same thing, right? I mean, the same writer, so he's like, Jesus goes up into heaven. And so the disciples are all standing there, they're looking up into heaven. And they're watching Jesus go and descend and ascending up into heaven. And two angels literally come up to all the disciples and go, so what are you all standing around looking up there for? They're like, well, Jesus just went up to heaven. They're like, yeah, but he didn't want you to just stand around and look up in heaven. He wanted you to get out and do something. You see, in the Gospel of Luke, Luke is reminding us that we have been freed from things. But in the book of Acts, it starts with the understanding that the freedom that we have been given in Jesus Christ is for something. We were not just given this freedom so that we could stand up there and look up into heaven and say, well, isn't this cool? We're free. No. We have been given this freedom so that we can go out and love our neighbors. The way that Charlie wrote it out of Galatians was, Paul says, we are slaves to our neighbors. We are given freedom so that we can help each other, so that we can be part of God's plan to make the world a flourishing, wonderful, hopefully less humid place than we have right now. And we have been given this freedom for something great. Now, in some cases, we may know what that is. Perhaps for some of us, the freedom is to be able to continue to create community. You may have fed family or something like that. And so in the next few days, you're going to have a big family 4th of July gathering. That could be what your freedom was given to you for. For other people, it could be to begin to work for better land. One of the things that we have to always wonder about is land. Takes time. We have to work it. We have to be a part of it. We have to understand it. And maybe that's what you were given, the gift of farming. I mean, that's a gift. And so we find things that we've been given for. Not necessarily the freedom from stuff, which has kind of trapped us and kept us from doing stuff, but now the question is the freedom for. And it's a little harder because it doesn't, we don't get it. It's not like you get it's not like when you get baptized, I hand you a pack saying, here's God's, life plan for you. Go try to live it. That's not how it works. We do it day by day, step by step. But there is a freedom about it. And the biggest stress then that we have is that we don't take the freedom for something and fall back into the trap of being enslaved by it. So that all of a sudden we find ourselves not free again. It's a constant balance to make sure that we don't lose this gift of freedom. Because it's this gift of freedom that Jesus has given us in his death and resurrection that has allowed us to be able to put aside the things that have oppressed us and kept us down. It has allowed us to put aside those unreal expectations that we had of ourselves or others might have had of us. And to be able to say those have been set aside by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We call that forgiveness. But then on the other hand, to be able to make sure that we continually live in the freedom that we've been given so that we don't have to squander, so that we don't have to say that we've wasted our lives, to wonder if it's all worth it. But to rather say that this is precisely what God has put us here for. And it may be, as far as I know, it seems like this is what God is doing, at least in my 60-some years, is that God kind of says, I'm going to have you do this for a while, maybe do this for a while, maybe do this for a while. Now, you might be one of those people that kind of got a job description from God, and you've just been living it out, and it's been going great. Mine seems to change every 7 to 10 years. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a Sagittarius. I don't know. But nonetheless, we always have these ways in which we continually live in the reality that God has created us for, the freedom for something. So what we do when we gather here around this font or around this table is pray that God will continue to release us from the bondages that trap us, our own fears, our own prejudices, our own biases that keep us so enthralled in sin. And that once God frees us from those things, when we walk out, we walk freed for being a help to our neighbor, somebody who can reach out, who have, maybe you've got, some time and energy and you can help somebody. Maybe you don't have time and energy, but you have some spare cash and you can help somebody. However it works out in your life. To be able to celebrate the gift of freedom is not only to give thanks that you've been freed from the things that have oppressed you, but also to be able to celebrate the gift of freedom is to give thanks for the things that God has allowed you to do. So this 4th of July holiday has not only a sense of thankfulness that we've been freed from something, but a gratitude that we've been freed for something. And this interplay between thankfulness and gratitude, being freed for something to be freed for, is the life of freedom that we live in Jesus Christ. It is finally the gift and the power of the Holy Spirit. That as we walk step by step, day by day, we follow in God's footsteps, giving thanks that we've been freed from the things that trap us, in gratitude for the freedom that allows us to be the people God has made us to be. Amen.